Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. I've got two half-baked ideas to discuss with you today. So the conversation might be a bit meandering and exploratory, but I hope you enjoy it nonetheless. Maybe by the end of this episode, my half-baked ideas might be a little bit more baked, maybe 2/3 baked. We'll see. Okay, the first, it's an idea. An idea that I've had for a little while, and often you might have an idea, but it doesn't really take any definite shape until you find a way to articulate it. And I think I found a way to articulate it. I was listening to Radio 4 the other day, and they were talking about the abolition of NHS England, the pros and cons of getting rid of NHS England. I won't go into that now. Indeed, I don't really know anything about it, but the expert they were interviewing was talking about something called mission creep, and she was suggesting that a lot of what NHS England does now is the result of mission creep, and it's far beyond the original purpose or remit of NHS England. So gradually over the years, the service or the organisation has kind of just taken on more and more responsibilities just by gradual creep, okay? Just kind of gradually taking on extra jobs. And kind of, so when those jobs were initially taken on, it might have been thought, okay, this is kind of a little bonus. We're doing a little extra. We won't do it for too long. But all of a sudden, it's properly absorbed into the organisation, and they're now doing it all the time. So there's this idea of mission creep where you just gradually take on more and more blindly, and you end up doing a lot more than you originally set out to, and perhaps doing lots of things that were beyond the original purpose or your original remit. And it was this idea of mission creep which I think helped me. It kind of summed up some of the thoughts I had been having about workload in schools. So I think that this idea of mission creep can be applied, interestingly, to both the individual teacher level and at the school level as well. So first, at the individual teacher level, I'll take a concrete example. So take the question of whether teachers should be required or expected to set cover work if they're poorly. I mean, really, the answer should be no. If you're poorly, you're poorly. You shouldn't be expected to do work if you're poorly. I mean, that's the whole reason you're not in work, because you're poorly and you're not capable of doing work. So you can't really be expected reasonably to do work from home. Instead, you should be resting. If you were in a fit state to be doing work from home, you should probably be in school. So it is a bit nonsensical, I think, to expect sick and poorly teachers to set cover work. We should have better processes within school to generate cover work quickly when teachers are ill. But anyway, so we've got this question of whether teachers should be required or expected to set cover work. And I think that the sensible answer is no, as I've explained. And I should say, I think that lots of people intuitively agree with that sensible answer. Okay, yeah, we shouldn't. Teachers shouldn't be expected to set cover work. And imagine that was the policy in a school. Teachers are not expected to set cover work, not required to set cover work. If you're poorly, you go away, you rest, and that's it. Okay? Get better quickly as soon as you can and come back to school. Yeah, so imagine that was the situation in school. No cover work is expected from poorly teachers. However, you then get some teachers who will do it anyway. Okay, so they are poorly. They appreciate that there probably is some grey area here where you might be too poorly to come into school, but you might not be poorly enough so that you can't sit on your laptop at home and just send a few emails and send some cover work in. So these teachers, perhaps the more conscientious teachers, I'm using that word in the psychological sense. So teachers who score more highly on the conscientiousness scale, they'll do it anyway. They will send in cover work despite the fact that it is not expected or required in their school. They'll do it anyway. They also appreciate, they know their students well. They know what they can and can't handle in a cover lesson. They know where they are within the scheme of learning. They know what the best topics would be for the students to revise. They know which topics the students might be able to handle seeing for the first time in a cover lesson without their usual teacher. So they feel that even though they're poorly at home, they're still the best in the best position out of anyone to set this cover work, and so they do it anyway. And like I said, it's more likely that it's the highly conscientious teachers who are going to do this, okay, even in a school where it isn't required to set cover or expected for teachers to set cover when they're poorly. And then other teachers, perhaps the higher ups as well, more generally speaking, when they're looking around the school for examples of best practice to share, their eyes might fall upon these sorts of teachers, the highly conscientious, really caring teachers. And they'll look and they'll see and they'll think, okay, these also happen to be really good teachers. So what sorts of things are they doing that makes the difference? And I'm sure that they're doing a whole host of extra things. So in the same way that they would set cover work if they're poorly, despite the fact that there's no expectation to, at least initially, they're probably doing loads of extra other bits and bobs, going above and beyond here and there in loads of different areas, okay? And so colleagues and leaders look at this and they think, right, well, this person's an excellent teacher. They're doing all these extra little bits and bobs here and there, going above and beyond. So perhaps that's what we should expect other teachers to do as well. And again, colleagues might start to form these expectations implicitly. Leaders might start to look and form them more explicitly and start turning it into policy. And then all of a sudden, the expectations have shifted. Because you've got these excellent teachers who are just kind of naturally, due to some aspect of their character or personality, they're naturally going above and beyond. It becomes the expectation that teachers in general should go above and beyond. And then all of a sudden, what was formerly above and beyond is now the new norm. So because you had these one or two exceptional teachers who did decide to set cover, even when they were poorly, that gradually creates the expectation that other teachers, if they want to be excellent too, should also be setting cover. And this is a great example of mission creep. You have a few individuals who've gone above and beyond. That's created the general expectation that everyone needs to go above and beyond. And all of a sudden, the above and beyond is now the new norm. And that process repeats and repeats and repeats. And all of a sudden, teachers are expected to do more and more and more and more. And so, whereas once teachers might not have been expected to set cover when they're away, all of a sudden they now are expected to set cover when they're away. It may even turn into a formal requirement that they set cover when they're away. And so the mission and the workload of your average teacher has increased. However, going back to that original teacher, that one who, despite the fact that they weren't expected to go above and beyond, went above and beyond anyway, and did set some extra cover work and perhaps did lots of other little bits and bobs that, were beyond the original remit or purpose or expectation. They did them anyway because they're highly conscientious or whatever. Okay, going back to that original person, that original teacher, as an observer looking in, you see them doing all this extra work. And so it's perhaps easy to conclude that it's all the extra work that's making the difference in their lessons. And it's all that extra work, setting cover work when they're ill, doing other things here and there, that's what makes the difference to them being an excellent teacher. However, that probably isn't the case. It's probably the fact that they're highly conscientious and they're highly caring. And their students in lessons can feel this from them. Students feel valued. They have really positive relationships for learning. And that's what makes the difference. So you've got this highly conscientious teacher who happens to be an excellent teacher and who also happens to do lots of extra work around their teaching responsibilities. And so outsiders looking in might think it's all the extra work that they do around their teaching responsibilities that makes them the excellent teacher. Whereas in fact, it was just because they're highly conscientious. And that's less tangible. It might be less easy to see as an outside observer. So you might not conclude that, it's because they're highly conscientious. And it would be unreasonable, actually, to expect everyone to be highly conscientious. So conscientiousness is one of the big 5 aspects of personality. And those are pretty rigid. It's quite difficult, the research suggests anyway, as far as I'm aware anyway. It's quite difficult to change your personality. So it would be unreasonable to expect all teachers to suddenly jump up in their conscientiousness levels. But it wouldn't be unreasonable if you, from an outside observer looking in, you see all this extra work that this conscientious teacher is doing, and you might think that it's the extra work that's making the difference. And that is a more tangible expectation or requirement to introduce. Then all of a sudden you're thinking, okay, I should be doing the extra work as well. So should my colleagues. Leaders might think similarly. And then all of a sudden you've got these policy changes happening. Whereas in fact, it really, at the end of the day, had nothing to do with the extra work that the conscientious teacher was doing because they're conscientious. It was in fact due to the fact that they are conscientious. And that's what makes them the better teacher. That's what makes them have the more positive relationships with their students, upon which everything else is built. So what's the moral of this discussion, this half-baked idea? Well, it's to beware of mission creep, I guess. If you have an outstanding teacher in your department who does go above and beyond in terms of workload, who does go above and beyond in workload, due to some aspect of their personality perhaps, don't be too quick to conclude that they're excellent because they take on more work. It might in fact have something to do with some innate aspect of their personality, which can't reasonably be expected of other teachers. Indeed, we all have our own personalities, our own strengths and weaknesses. So beware of mission creep. And I guess I could relate this to what I discussed in the last episode of the podcast. When deciding whether to take on extra work as a teacher, you should ask yourself 2 questions. Does it improve the quality of my explanations? Does it make my students feel more valued? And if the answer to either of those questions is yes, then it might be a good idea to do it. But if the answer to both of those questions is no, then you can probably forget about it. Or at least push it a little bit further down your to-do list, worry about it another day, especially if you've already got a lot to do, which we do as teachers. So that was the first thing I wanted to discuss today. It's mission creep. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that one. Oh, okay, yes, I did also forget. I said that I thought this idea of mission creep applies interestingly at the individual teacher level and also at the school level. I only discussed the individual teacher level, but I mean, from that discussion, it's not too hard to see how it would apply at the school level as well. You can see how schools themselves might end up taking on more and more responsibilities and more jobs, which should be ultimately the responsibilities of other organisations. And they do it because there are other exceptional schools out there which seem to be taking on these additional responsibilities too. And so other schools want to be outstanding, want to be exceptional too. So they do the same thing. They take on this additional work. Okay. Whereas in fact, the school that's outstanding might be outstanding for some far less tangible reason. It might not be due to all that additional work that they do. It could be due to the sorts of teachers that happen to be employed there. It could be due to lots of different things. that has nothing to do with the increased workload that they've kind of organically taken on over the years. So anyway, there you go. Right now, before I talk about the next thing, my usual Patreon plea. This episode took around 2 to 3 hours to produce, and that's about average, and I aim to produce 2 episodes a month, so that's anywhere between kind of 4 to 6 hours that I spend producing this podcast a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so £2 to £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on the Patreon. And if you do sign up, you'll be helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution is greatly appreciated. And you'll also gain exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions, which are released a week before the episodes appear on the usual platforms. As always, the link to the Patreon will be in the show notes. All right, on to this next thing. I mean, if the last idea was half-baked, this one's raw. So, I run a philosophy of education reading group at my school, which I really, really enjoy, and I'm so thankful for the people who attend that group. I love having those discussions. And recently, we read Paulo Freire. I'm still not sure whether I'm pronouncing his second name correctly, but it's spelt Freire. I should check that now. Not even sure of the spelling. No, I did get it right. Freire. And he wrote a famous book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And we read a chapter from that book where he spoke and critiqued what he called the banking model of education. And according to the banking model of education, students sit in a room. They're these kind of empty vessels, and the teacher is stood there at the front with all the knowledge, and the teacher's responsibility is to deposit knowledge into these empty vessels, into these students. And so it's a very passive sort of education, top down. The teacher has all the knowledge and the authority and needs to pass that on to these kind of passive, empty students who gradually over the course of their education get kind of more and more filled up with knowledge and so on. And he critiqued this form of education because he thought it was alienating and dehumanizing, and most importantly, it wouldn't create the sorts of critical citizens who would be able to see the problems in society and try to address them. So he thought that the better form of education was essentially more along the lines of what we would call student-centered or discovery or guided discovery. So again, we've got this usual divide between kind of knowledge-rich direct instruction, which Freire was attacking with this banking analogy. Okay, he thought that just produced passive, robotic people who were barely people at all. He thought it denied them their humanity, so he didn't like that. On the other side of this ideological divide, you've got the more student-centered, discovery-based approach, where the teacher and the student are kind of more on the same level. So at one point in the chapter, Freire says the teacher should be a student and the student should also be a teacher. So there's this kind of mirroring aspect between the teacher and the student. They should work together. They should engage in a problem-solving education, where the problems are the problems that society faces. So the teacher and the student together should look critically at society and figure out what's wrong with society, and then work together to learn how to make the world a better place. And importantly, together. That's the important part. They need to come together because a lot of the problems that society faces can only be resolved through collective action. We all need to come together, work together. And again, that was another problem that he had with the knowledge-rich direct instruction banking model of education. He thought it carved people off into individuals who would be less likely to kind of work together, kind of dehumanized individuals who would be less likely to come together to see the problems with society and work together to resolve them. So there you go. That was kind of, my summary of Freire's ideas in that chapter of his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I've been thinking about it quite a lot, and I think he's very much onto something. I think that the knowledge-rich direct instruction approach to education does encourage young people to just be receivers of knowledge, not questioners of knowledge. And so if young people get into the habit of just being passive receivers or passive receptacles, then they're not going to look around them and think that they can change anything, let alone spot any problems with society. They've been trained just to accept things as they are. So they're not going to be agents of change. Whereas on the other side, if you have the more project-based, student-centered, discovery style of learning, which centers on the problems of society, so it's concerned specifically with what's wrong with the world and how we can understand those problems and hopefully come together to address them, that is going to create citizens who might be able to make the world a better place. Now, so I was thinking that I think I agree. I think I agree with Freire. I think he's really onto something here. And so I got to thinking, which sorts of young people are in most need of this sort of problem-based education that Freire is advocating, in opposition to the usual knowledge-rich direct instruction approach. So which sorts of young people is it who need this most? Well, it's the most disadvantaged young people, because, by definition, they're the ones who feel the problems of society most deeply and who the problems of society affect the most. Many of the issues and problems, if not all of the issues and problems that disadvantaged, poorer people face, those are the manifestations of the broader problems with society. So it's the disadvantaged people who need, more than anyone else, this problem-based type of education, which is going to turn them into critical citizens who can look at their own situation and the situation of their family and friends and think, no, this isn't right. We are disadvantaged. It needs to change. Let's come together and change it. So it's the disadvantaged people who are in the disadvantaged young people who are in most need of this sort of education, and indeed who could create the most change if they came together and worked together. However, I think it's the very same people who are the least likely to receive this sort of education. And I don't think it's maybe it is by design. It's all quite worrying, really. It can be anyway if you follow this train of thought down a rabbit hole. But I think when I look at the schools that operate and do amazing work in the most disadvantaged communities, and I have experience of working in such schools, disruptive behaviour is an ever-present threat in these sorts of schools. Behaviour can be really poor and behaviour can derail lessons. And I think that if you opted for the problem-based, student-centred, discovery learning approach that Freire wants, behaviour would become even more difficult to control. So in my experience, I've tried both types of approach, and I do find that the knowledge-rich, direct instruction approach, where students are sat on desks, sometimes even individual desks, facing the front, listening to me as the teacher, when I'm using that approach, behaviour is far easier to manage. All the students are facing the same way. It's far easier for me to tell as the teacher whether they're paying attention, whether they're doing work. the expectation is usually that students work independently and silently. And again, those expectations are very easy for me as the teacher to enforce, because it's immediately obvious if students veer away from those expectations. It's very it's very easy to see if a student's communicating with another. It's very easy to hear if students are making noise, if the expectation is absolute silence. So behaviour is easier to manage. And I think, therefore, that in these schools that serve more disadvantaged communities, where behaviour problems are more severe, these schools are more likely to opt for a knowledge-rich direct instruction approach, because behaviour is easier to manage. And so you have all of these young people, young disadvantaged people, who are in real need of an education that would turn them into critical citizens, so that they could see society for what it is and come together and work together and change society. Yet in their school, they're all sat individually during their lessons, not allowed to talk to one another, working in silence, and just being passive receptacles, robots, who are being trained to accept knowledge and accept the world as it is. Accept it passively, not with a critical mindset, a mindset that could bring about change. I mean, that's a bit of a caricature. I'm sure there are lots of schools and lots of teachers who do serve more disadvantaged communities, who do try to take a more problem-based discovery learning approach. I mean, we've got some teachers who do that in my school, a geography teacher in particular, who's doing incredible work. But my point is that it's just the simple point that if you take that approach, behaviour can be much more difficult to manage. And in a school where poor behaviour is an ever-present problem, you might be therefore likely as a teacher and as a school to adopt the knowledge-rich direct instruction approach rather than the problem-based discovery learning approach. And then look at it on the other side. Okay, so now think about those schools who serve the most privileged communities. Private schools, perhaps. Okay, much smaller classes, fewer behaviour problems, far more likely to be able to adopt a problem-based, student-centric discovery learning style approach because there are fewer behaviour problems, and so therefore far more likely to create critical citizens who can look at the system and see the problems with it. Except the problem is that those sorts of young people, the privileged young people who are in a position to benefit from that sort of education, they're already benefiting from the system the way it is. It's working in their favour. So, I mean, I'm sure there are lots of, people who've been born into privilege who are, highly philanthropic and do want to change the world for the better for everyone, especially the most disadvantaged. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, if you have benefited from the sort of education that's turned you into a critical citizen, and you can see the problems with society, except at the same time, those problems aren't affecting you, and in fact the system is benefiting you and your friends and your family, you'll be far less likely to want to change the system. So, I don't know, I'm going to try and sum this up. So, I think the sorts of people who are more likely to have the education that turns them into critical citizens who can change the world for the better will be less likely to want to change the world for the better, because for them the world is already pretty good. And on the other hand, you've got incredibly disadvantaged young people who are in desperate need of seeing the world for what it is and the problems with society, and who need to learn to be critical citizens, to come together and through collective action change the world. They're the ones who don't receive the sort of education that could turn them into those sorts of citizens. Because in their schools, behaviour can be a problem, and it's far easier to manage behaviour with a knowledge-rich direct instruction approach where students just sit silently at desks and work independently. But a student who works independently in silence and is a passive receptacle of knowledge is never going to band together with their peers and see the world for what it is and try to change it for the better. Or at least they'll be less likely to. I've spoken in absolutes a lot throughout this discussion to try and make my point, but really it's an issue of likelihoods. And so it's worrying. It's worrying. I'd be, like I said, a couple of half-baked ideas for you today, but I hope you found the discussion interesting, and I would be incredibly interested to hear your thoughts on either of the things I've discussed today. So the first thing regarding mission creep in schools, do you think that relates to your experience? And then secondly, this issue of whether the most disadvantaged in society are less likely to receive the education which would empower them to improve society and to make the world a better place. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk again soon. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.